Ja tervetuloa Studio Dentsuun. Tämä on meidän ensimmäinen lähetys ja mä oon Juha Halmesvaara Suomen Dentsulta. Tämän lisäksi meillä on tuolta UK:sta Lontoon puolelta lisävahvistuksia ja tänään käydään läpi markkinoinnin trendejä, miten ne vaikuttaa lyhyellä ja vähän pidemmällä tähtäimellä. Meitä on tällä hetkellä viimeisten huhujen mukaan noin 350 ihmistä linjoilla ja se on ihan superhieno määrä. Kiitos siitä, että olette kaikki jaksanut osallistua tähän. Siellä on kysymyskentät, mihin voitte laittaa kysymyksiä, palataan niihin sitten loppupuolella tätä kokonaisuutta ja materiaalithan tietysti tulee sitten jälkikäteen. Se ei ole ongelma. Mutta ennen kuin päästään asiaan, niin koska ilmaisia lounaita ei ole, aloitetaan yhden slaidin propagandalla. Eli Dentsuhan on Suomen suurin markkinointiviestinnän firma ja maailmalla meitä on melkein joka maasta löytyy Dentsu, 66 000 asiantuntijaa globaalisti ja Suomessa meillä on mennyt viime vuosi varsin hyvin, että meillä on palvelutarjoamaa löytyy strategiasta, tutkimukseen, analytiikkaan, tapahtumiin, konseptointiin, luovaan tekemiseen, mediaan ja nyt jo tästä tänä vuonna, niin jos Effiä nyt kertoo mitään markkinointiviestinnän tehokkuudesta, niin siellä oltiin mukana 6 keississä, jotka sai palkintoja, eli tehokkuus ja niin kuin tehokas kokonaismarkkinointi on lähellä meidän sydäntä. Mutta mennään päivän epistolaan. Meillä on tänään suomea ja englantia sujuvasti sekaisin, eli Dan puhuu tietysti Lontoota tuolta UK:n päästä, ja mä vaihan nyt hetkeksi englanniksi, ja kohta päästetään Dan sitten puheisiin. So we have Dan Calladine from the UK, and Dan been doing these trend sets for over 10 years now, and the why it's important is that during the late years we've been hitting 8 out of 10 trends that we've been putting in these sets. So it's really valuable for you guys to actually see these trends and then see which of these will actually happen this year. This year we don't have 10, we have 12 for you, so we have a few more added there for you. So but over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Juha. Thank you very much indeed. So firstly, thank you for having me to present to your clients and your colleagues here. It's always brilliant working in London to work with other agencies around the network. It's one of the things I think that makes Dentsu so special. And what I wanted to talk to you about today was really, what is happening in the world, how we as marketers, how we as brands can actually react to these things. And as Juha says, I have a list of 12 trends to talk to you about. Hopefully something like 9 or more than 9 of these will turn out to have been correct. And so without further ado, what I want to talk to you about is some of the trends that are shaping society and technology. And so if I move on to, thank you. Yes, so this is quite, just to let you into a little bit of what we're doing. We have a remote way of changing the slides with this. So it's sort of almost like magic that I'm sitting in my front room in London. You can see the background behind me and just tapping on my phone and getting the slides to change. Anyway, what we have for you today is 5 trends that are changing society and 7 trends which are changing things like media and technology. What I'm going to do is I'm going to speak obviously in English about some of these, and Juha is going to be coming in at various moments to give it a local perspective and obviously to speak in the local language as well. So the first trend that we think is really important about how we're living our lives today is what we call from FOMO to FOGO. So FOMO meant the fear of missing out. It was when you were looking at your Instagram feed and all your friends seem to be having much more successful, much more glamorous, much more exciting lives than you. Nowadays, when I think many of us are staying at home for something like 23.5 hours a day, we don't really get much of a sense of FOMO. Nobody seems to be living much more of a glamorous life than us, but we do have a sense of FOGO, which is the fear of going out, which is, very genuine. It's partly because the government is saying to us, you can't go out, or you can't go out as much as you used to, or there's a curfew or something like that. But also, I think and we forget this as quite a young industry, that people do genuinely have a fear of going out. They're fearful of contracting the virus. This is one of the reasons why I think that, where vaccines are available, the take up is so high. And so I think we need to really understand how this is changing us as a society and how this is changing things for brands. One of the things that I always look for when I do these trends, and particularly this year, is what is happening around the hospitality industry, so bars and restaurants, those sorts of things. And certainly in the UK, they've acted as what we call a canary in a coal mine. It's like an early warning signal for how things are likely to impact other businesses. And so what we've seen is the rise of experiences that you can have at home. So things like meal kits where, you can cook a meal from your favorite restaurant with all the branding and all their ingredients and all their secrets, but within your own home. Or obviously you can get a takeaway and things like that as well. You see things like recipe classes and all these sorts of things. So I think it's really fascinating how, as we move into this new remote world, these new ways of interacting with consumers and reaching customers with the same products and making them, sort of still be able to experience life as they used to. It's really interesting how this is evolving. As an example of this, once the pandemic is receding and once we have access to vaccines and things like that, we do expect this to continue. We don't expect this to go away completely. I think certainly for older people, maybe people over the age of 55 or even, maybe over the age of 45, will actually sort of think, well, I really enjoyed, staying at home more often. I enjoyed getting my groceries delivered. I enjoyed, for special occasions, ordering like a really special meal from a restaurant simply, rather than just some pizzas or something. And so I think many of these sorts of things will continue to stay with us. But obviously it will be very much, driven by age. And I think a lot of younger people are, desperate to go out and desperate to socialize much more again. But there are some really interesting things happening around this. And the picture on this slide shows something which Amazon has done, which is only in the US so far, but essentially they've taken the idea of an Airbnb virtual experience where you connect with a local somewhere and they either teach you a skill or they talk to you about their city. What Amazon has done is created this thing called Amazon Explore, where your local guide can take you for a walk around their area. So, maybe a walking tour of Vienna or something. But also, given that it's Amazon, you can go shopping. So there's ones that you can do in Tokyo where you can visit a cookware shop. And if there's something that you see that you really like, then you can buy it. And because it's Amazon, you know that it is very likely to arrive within a few days. So I think this is really interesting. It's an example of what brands are doing to help people stay more distanced. In terms of implications, what we see is that, I think it's more important than ever for brands to create what we would call a contactless path to purchase. So to allow people to experience the brand if they're sitting on their sofa at home just as easily as they would if they visit a showroom or if they visit a store or if they get to access it in the real world. This might include things like developing product, but also it includes things like thinking about the unboxing experience. So when something arrives through the post to somebody, is it going to look so glamorous that they'll take a picture of it and put it onto Instagram maybe? And, then you get back to the idea of FOMO again, possibly. So the second one of the trends I wanted to talk about was what we call the donut problem. And this is really related to the first one in that, we're meant to stay at home, but when we do go out, we're staying much more locally. So certainly for me, I haven't been on public transport for something like 2 months. I certainly am not going into the office. Every morning I go for a walk around my local area. All my shopping is done locally or online. And so I think what we're seeing, and there's data to back this up, is how people are living much more locally. The city centres are hollowed out. So if you think about a picture of a city, you get this sort of space in the middle where the centre is because people aren't commuting and they're not going to the big shops as much. And this is why we call it the donut problem. So if you think about the causes of this, the biggest one is the lack of commuting, and then also the lack of wanting to go into the center to go shopping because again you're scared of getting the virus. But if you think about it in terms of what we do, how we work as media people, how we work as marketers, many of the sort of targeting decisions that we've always taken have been based on the idea of people leaving the house in the morning, having 45 minutes or an hour as a commute, and there being lots of media opportunities within this with things like morning newspapers and radio and podcasts and those sorts of things, and then in the evening doing the opposite. And so if these media opportunities disappear, we need to think about new ways to target people. And again, looking to the future, Sorry, my clicker wasn't working for a second. If we look into the future, what we do think is that even when workers go back to the office, they won't be going back 5 days a week, and we will still have an element of this much more local living. We expect to see things like outdoor spaces in local areas being used in much more creative ways. And also, I think there are some really interesting things happening around local based media. So, for example, Google Maps is trying to become much more about discovery than simply searching for places you already know. And again, if we think about the implications for this one, I think there's a much more of a role now for location-based marketing, because I think we try to work out, over the course of a week, what sort of location does somebody go to, because we can't simply be targeting people when they commute as we did before. I think there's a lot of scope for things like digital out of home, where you can vary the messages by location really easily, and you can use cues like weather and temperature and those sorts of things as well. And then also, I think for retail, there's a big implication, because if we're not, if we're not going into the city centre to go shopping, then I think there's a great deal of potential for bringing the shops more to people with things like, maybe a 1 year or a 6-month pop-up shop for things like luxury brands. The next trend I wanted to talk about is what we call connected lives. And this is really a recognition that we now have far more devices in our homes that connect to the internet and, are sending out data and are tracking us and telling us things. The chart here is based on UK data. What it shows is that over the last 5 years or so, the number of connected devices an individual owns has risen by more than 50%. And while it's UK data, I think it's probably indicative of what is happening, certainly around the Western world. On the right-hand side, you'll see a smart fridge. I don't think things like smart fridges are really taking off, but what is taking off is more the idea of things like smart fitness. So things like Peloton, things like Zwift, and it's the idea that, perfect for the moment, because you can't go to the gym. So why not do this in your home? But instead of trying to motivate yourself and trying to, remember to use your exercise bike or your running machine, this actually has classes where you exercise with other people, and it's diary invitations in for you, because you know that at 8:30 in the morning you do such and such and stuff. And so I think we'll see a lot more of these sorts of things. Although, if you think about specific brands, Peloton has something like 3 to 4 million users around the world. So let's not get completely carried away with this. But certainly the direction of traffic is there, in that, when we look at what Google are planning to do, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, they all are planning to launch new devices in the next year or the next few years or so. So I think the number of devices that we have that connect to the internet will never be lower. And what I think is really important is that we as marketers think about how our brands can fit into the different ecosystems that are being created. So we know how our brands can fit onto somebody's phone or onto somebody's laptop, but how might they fit onto a Peloton? How might they fit onto a pair of smart glasses? How might you get onto somebody's earbuds? Rather than simply the two most frequent screens that they look at. So that was the third of the trends affecting society. The fourth one is quite big and quite existential, and it's the idea that there's now much more concern, much more focus, much more interest in the idea of data privacy. So all these devices that I was talking about in the last trend are potentially collecting data on us and potentially sharing this data. And so I think people are becoming much more concerned with what happens to their data, to the point that you have companies like Apple, which actually market themselves based on the idea that this is a private device. This is a device that isn't actually sharing your data, that is actually on your software. So we see this. We also see privacy-centric services like DuckDuckGo, a privacy-first search engine. We're seeing the usage of that. We're also seeing browser.
Ja ilmeisesti Danilla pieniä teknisiä haasteita äänen kanssa, niin yritetään saada mies takas linjoille tuosta tehokkaasti.
And so if we think about the implications for this one, it goes without saying that we need to be fully compliant with regulations, but not just the letter of the law, the spirit of the law as well, the sort of the feeling that people have and the feeling that the public have. Given that people are becoming much more concerned about this, I think brands need to make sure that they have as much control over the data that they collect on their customers as possible, which means things like more first-party data. And then the final one of the society trends is what we call the Great Divide, and it's really an acknowledgement that society has never felt more divided than it was. And, the context of this really was, we were writing this in sort of October, November last year, when you had the run-up to the US election, and then the time after the US election. We'd also seen things like the Black Lives Matter protests during the summer. We were also very conscious of things like Extinction Rebellion and the protests that they've been mounting. And when you look at the numbers, the number of public protests has risen by something like 10% a year for the last 10 years or so. So this is very much the society that we're living in. We honestly hope that the world will become less divided. And, this is based on things like Joe Biden in the White House rather than Donald Trump, but also the collaboration and the collective working that the world's governments are starting to do around things like, response to the virus, and also, things like vaccine policies and things like this. And so the implications are, in a very political world, I think brands need to know where they stand. I don't think brands need to, volunteer a point of view on every topic, in the same way that I don't, I know where I stand on a lot of political issues, but I don't necessarily wear badges. I don't necessarily go on marches. So I think it's really important to know where you stand, to be very transparent, to be aware of the brand's history as well, adverts that may have been run 20 years ago, but really just to sort of, have empathy with the public and understand that we're in a much more divided world, and people are going to ask questions now more than they did before. So now I'm going to pass back to Juha, who's going to give some local perspective on the trends I was talking about.
Going back, ja sitten mennään taas suomeksi, meinasi jäädä lontoon kieli päälle. Eli nämä trendit, mitä Dan tuossa kävi läpi nyt niin kuin tavallaan globaalissa näkökulmasta, niin nämä näkyy meillä aika selkeästi myös Suomessakin. Et esimerkiksi toi perus niin kuin fear of going out puoli niin on näkynyt Suomessa jo pitkään. Vanhemmat ihmiset ei käy kaupoissa. Meillä nousee ruoan verkkokauppaa hirveässä kasvussa. Voltin kuskit tuntuu suhailevan enemmän kuin taksikuskit tällä hetkellä. Ja kun katsotaan noita keskustan liikennemääriä, niin esimerkiksi Helsingissä niin ne on tippunut ennen koronaan verrattuun aikaan niin 44%, Tampereella 34%, monessa muussa kaupungissa pienemmässä nähdään ihan samantyyppistä laskua. Mutta jostain syystä Turussa ei ole minkäännäköistä muutosta. Se oli tippunut joku 0,6 tai 0,8%. En tiedä, onko turkulaiset niin kuin muuten erikoista porukkaa vai johtuuko se kylmästi siitä, että siellä on ollut se Turun keskusta ihan pommireikä jo jo pidemmän aikaa erinäisten remonttien vuoksi, mutta muuten Suomessa niin selkeästi rankkaa tiputusta keskustoissa pyörimisessä, ja tämä näkyy tietysti aika vahvasti sitten siinä, että ravintolalla menee heikommin, ne keksii omia kuljetuspalveluitaan ja pyrkii sit sitä kautta saamaan sen bisneksen pyörimään, mutta se on ihan niin kuin suoraan copypastettu maailmalta myös Suomeen. Tämä Connected Lives-puoli, eli käytännössä Wi-Fi-verkoissa tai muuten ATK:ssa olevat päätelaitteet, niin Suomessa ollaan oltu siinä ihan niin kuin samassa trendissä kuin maailmallakin, että meillä, niin kuin jos miettii, niin ainakin markkinointipiireissä ja muutenkin niin näkyy ouransormuksia ja älykelloja, ja Polaria Suunto on ollut pitkään tuossa health ja fitness- ja palautusbisneksessä, mutta jostain syystä niin me ollaan hyvin insinöörivetoisesti oltu tilanteessa, että meillä on niinku rautaa, mutta meillä on hirveän vähän tilauspalveluita. Et kuntosaleillakin on erityyppisiä kuukausimaksullisia, missä voisit katsoa niinku jälkikäteen niitä filkkoja. Joku ehkä tekee niitä jo livenäkin, mutta siinä meillä olisi tuossa palvelubisneksessä varmasti paljon potentiaalia ottaa sitten muuhun verrattuna. Tietoturvasta me listattiin tuohon Suomen top 10 salasanat, se kertoo paljon suomalaisten asennoitumisesta sitten tuohon tietoturvabisnekseen, että siitä on paljon puhuttu, että niin kuin lähtien siis Cambridge Analyticasta, niin että miten tärkeää on miettiä sitä omaa dataa ja edistää sitä tavallaan niin kuin oman tietoturvan tekemistä, mutta edelleen tänä päivänäkin Facebook-feedeissä näkyy niitä, testaa mikä marsu oli sitten testejä tai oletko älykäs vai onko kaverisi älykkäämpi, mikä loppujen lopuksi menee pelkästään vaan niin kuin datamyyntiin sit sieltä eteenpäin. Et paljon puhutaan, mutta valitettavasti niin tietoturvan osalta niin iso osa kansasta vielä on varsin välinpitämättömiä. Ja se on tietysti asia, mikä toivottavasti muuttuu ja on asia, mikä varsinkin markkinoijien pitää ottaa tosissaan, että mietitään, mitä dataa me oikeasti sitten kerätään ja hyödynnetään. Toinen, mikä on näkynyt tuossa niin kuin, tavallaan niin kuin Great Divide-puolella on se, että Canonistahan on puhuttu paljon tavallaan Jenkeissä. Suomessa se jostain syystä uiskenteli joogapiireihin, että siellä on niin kuin levitetty sitä ihan huolella. Ja se ei ehkä ole se ensimmäinen paikka, missä me oltaisiin ajateltu, että niin kuin salaliittoteoriat lähtee pyörimään liikkeelle. Ja poliittinen ympäristö nyt ihan sanomattakin on selvää, että se on hyvin jakaantunut niin kuin kahteen osaan. Et Suomessa sitten on jo pitkään näkyvissä ollut erilaisia boikotteja esimerkiksi kärkkäistä kohtaan, tai Finlayson on pitkään niin kuin pyrkinyt vastuullisempaan tuotantoon, ja viimeisimpänähän niillä oli Beatles-henkinen ulostulo ja hetki sitten, missä pyritään vielä entisestään parantaa sitä. Et me nähdään näitä ihan samoja tavallaan niin kuin trendejä, missä pyritään valitsemaan puolensa, ja ne aika hyvin Suomeen suht nopeasti tuolta maailmalta myös kopioituu. Ja sitten takaisin mieheen, jolla on maailman hienoin titteli, eli Dan Calladine, Head of Media Futures. Please take over and continue with the trends.
Thank you. That must be my cue. Again, it's fantastic to be able to do this and speak to everybody, but it's also fantastic just to see how we can do this virtually from two different cities in the world, and work very seamlessly. So I now have three more trends which I'm going to talk about before I pass back to Juha. And these are trends which are sort of based on media and based on technology. And many of these have actually partly or fully come about as a result of the pandemic. And the first one of these is what we call the camera's new life. And it's really the idea that the technology within our phones is allowing us to do new things, and people are increasingly adopting this sort of behavior. So the two main technologies we're talking about, one is augmented reality, the second is QR codes. With augmented reality, it's essentially a perfect technology for the times that we're living in, because it allows people to experience things without leaving their homes, without leaving their sofa. They can actually see things through their phone. So the picture shows somebody trying on a pair of shoes, theoretically, or sort of not actually trying them on, because you can't see if they're too tight or they don't fit or something like that, but you can certainly see what they would look like at the end of your legs if you bought them. And we've also seen examples like this with things like sunglasses. This is happening a lot within things like cosmetics. So augmented reality is a perfect technology for our times. If we think about the number of people who use augmented reality, this is also going up markedly. So some stats I saw earlier this week from Snapchat say that something like 75% of Snapchat users, which is about 200 million people, are using augmented reality every day. And that's simply one app. So I think we can safely say that something like 500 million to 1 billion people probably using augmented reality every day around the world. So, it's becoming incredibly mainstream, particularly with some target audiences. But what we're also seeing is this sort of technology being used, potentially for putting things in your homes, like, if you're buying furniture from something like IKEA, you can find what the furniture would look like in your home, how well it would fit by using an augmented reality app. And these technologies aren't new, but it's just that the time is right for them now. And even something like Pokemon Go, which is probably one of the most famous uses of augmented reality, has actually had a record year in 2020 because they switched the app so that people could actually play in home. They didn't have to go for a walk around their local neighborhood, and they saw their usage and their revenues rising. And then, of course, the other aspect of camera-based technology is the incredible rise of adoption of QR codes. So people like me have always talked about QR codes, people who work in my sort of roles within agencies, but they've never really taken off in the West in the way that they had in Asia. But suddenly we've got this position where, because of things like track and trace apps, QR codes are now incredibly relevant for many of us. And some data collected, I think, in about August last year said that something like, between 50% and a third of people around Europe were using QR codes in a typical week because it simply allowed them to live much more normal lives. And this is something that we wouldn't have predicted. And so the implication is that, given that these two technologies are now, much more mass market than they were, there's lots of scope for brands to be using them who might have previously been quite skeptical of the technologies and thought, well, the adoption is quite low, so we don't really want to experiment with this sort of thing. Particularly with things like QR codes, I think there's a lot of scope for using these within advertising, within advertising on posters, in newspapers, that sort of thing. My next trend is what we call the screen-free media. So this is essentially any form of media that doesn't use a screen. And while there is a picture of a smart speaker at this point, we're not talking solely about voice. Yes, things like voice are really important, and we see more people getting smart speakers. We see more people using voice-based search, but we're also talking about things like sonic branding. So, like the little bit of music that comes on before the Netflix show that you're watching. But also we're talking about the rise of digital audio, so particularly things like podcasting. And when we think about podcasting, when I said in the early trend, the donut problem, I talked about podcasting as a commuter-based medium. And it was certainly true that until about this time last year, podcasting was very much seen as something that people listened to on their commute to and from work. What we've seen as a result of the pandemic and the lockdowns is we're not seeing the same sort of peaks of usage in the morning and the evening, but what we are seeing is a greater amount of usage throughout the day. And what podcast companies tell us is that something like 25% more people are listening to podcasts, and total episodes listened to has gone up by something like 50%, or even, it's even doubled in some cases. And we're also seeing, people like Spotify investing huge amounts of money in building up podcast content, building up podcast technologies. And so what we're seeing is, audio becoming a really interesting and a really dynamic advertising medium, in that if people are listening on their phones, it's much more easy to target them with things like location-based targeting. Again, potentially things like the weather. You can even alter the creative message that they're getting based on, what time of day it is, and there are technologies that will do all this automatically. And there's even now a technology that will allow you to use audio-based advertising that people can respond to by speaking. So the advert might say at the end, sorry, this is where my phone always jumps into life when I'm presenting to people. The advert might say at the end, would you like a free sample? And then if you said, yes, please send me a free sample, then then it would take you into a process. And this is something which hasn't been possible with audio advertising before. And so I think the implication for this is that for all brands, it's a really good time to develop an audio-based strategy, including things like voice search. So how do people pronounce the name of the brand? Something like sonic identity, podcasting. So would you advertise within podcasting? Would you have your own podcasts? And also what the relationship is between the brand and music. And then finally, for this section, I wanted to talk about the trend that we call the decade of paid. And this is the idea that many media and content choices available to people are now paid for and not primarily funded by advertising. So clearly you think about things like Netflix, you think about things like Disney Plus, but then also some newspapers are going down this route. And one of the best examples of this is the New York Times. And over the last 20 years or so, they have gone from being something like 70% funded by advertising to something like 70% funded by reader subscriptions. And what this is, this is partly due to the publications wanting to make themselves much more focused on their readers than the advertising. But also it's due to things like ad blocking. It's due to things like the potential impact something like Apple's iOS 14 operating system change is going to have, where essentially it's going to become much harder to target and retarget people within Apple apps. And so essentially publishers are looking for other ways to fund themselves. In terms of the implications for this, what we think is going to happen is that the amount of really high quality ad inventory is going to fall. I mean, you only need to think about Netflix to see this. The 2 hours I spend watching Netflix in the evening is 2 hours I don't spend watching TV with adverts in the middle of it. And you can see that, potentially with things like news websites as well. So I think the amount of really good ad inventory is likely to fall, and, the demand for it potentially will go up, so prices could go up for the inventory that is still available. But then also, I think many publishers will struggle under the new system, and so there may be really interesting opportunities where publishers are much more willing to do very deep integrations or content integrations, all those sorts of things that they might not have been willing to do otherwise. And then again, at this point, I'm going to pass back over to Juha to give a local perspective.
Thank you, Dan. Ja Suomen osalta, niin jos kelataan taaksepäin tuossa, mistä hypättiin äsken Daniin, niin AR:n ja miksei QR:nkin kohdalta, niin Suomessahan meidän ei tarvitse onneksi kirjautua QR-koodeilla tällä hetkellä vielä mihinkään. En tiedä, olisiko se parempi niin päin kuin tämä nykyinen setup, jossa odotellaan rokotuksia vuoteen 2046, mutta pidetään siitä eri seminaari siitä aiheesta. AR:n osalta niin Suomessahan esimerkiksi Arilyn on ollut pitkään jo olemassa ja siellä on niin kuin monia esimerkkejä sieltä. Meillä tietysti nämä globaalit appit, niin kuin Pokemon Ghost ja muista toimii ihan samalla lailla ja Snapchatit ja muut. Mutta kyllä Suomessa markkinointi, esimerkiksi Arla on tehnyt useamman AR-lähdön, jossa on sitten tuotu pelillisiä elementtejä ja viihdytyselementtejä erilaisiin maitotuotteisiin. Ja se tulee varmasti kasvamaan ja todennäköisesti tämä tulee olemaan niin kuin tekki, tavallaan niin kuin KV-vetoinen peli myös sitten, että ehkä enemmän hyödynnetään niitä alustoja, jotka on jo olemassa, kun Suomen pienemmillä resursseilla sitten tälle markkinalle rakennetaan erikseen ehkä mitään asioita. Ja tämä on varmasti hyvä tapa kasvattaa sitten konversioita ja vietettyä brändin kanssa viettyä aikaa myös Suomessakin. Ja tuohon äänen osalta, niin meillä on Suomessa niin kuin pieni kielialuehaaste. Meitä on se vähän reilu 5 miljoonaa. Ja siitä tulee se ongelma, että esimerkiksi Alexa ja nämä muut puheäpit ei vielä erityisen hyvin osaa suomea, jos ollenkaan. Ja sitä voi jokainen kokeilla. Meidän lapset ainakin päivittäin lähes yrittää saada Antti Tuiskua tai muita suomalaisia artisteja Alexasta ulos. Ja ne on vähintään mielenkiintoisia ne lopputulokset, mitä sieltä sitten tulee. Mutta Suomessahan on olemassa lahjoita projekti tai hanke, missä halutaan, että ihmiset lahjoittaisiin puhetta tekoälyn kehittämiseen, jotta se joskus sitten voisi puhua suomea, ymmärtäisi kaikki slangit, murteet ja pystyttäisiin aidosti viemään sitä eteenpäin, koska niin kauan kun sun pitää ajatukset kääntää englanniksi tai muuksi kieleksi, niin se tulee hidastaa sitä, että vaikka itsekin voi kotona valot sammuttaa äänikäskyllä, niin silti se on kyllä nopeampaa edelleen käydä siitä nappulasta laittamasta ennemmin kuin miettii, miten se nyt menikään Lontooksi tällä kertaa. Ja tilausbisneksessä, niin Suomessa tietysti on paljon peliteollisuutta, jotka on niin kuin mikroostojen ja muiden tilausjuttujen kautta pystynyt sitä ihan globaalilla tasolla edistämään. Ehkä niin kuin maksu-TV-puolessa mietitään niin kuin kotimaisia pelureita, niin urheilu on ehkä ollut se, minkä tekosyyllä sitten on ihmiset saatu maksamaan asioista niin kuin TV-ruudun tai jonkun näköisen screenin äärellä. Ja sitten ikään kuin uutisbisneksessä, jos puhutaan niin kuin klassisesta sanomalehtibisneksestä, niin siellä on pystytty kuitenkin varsin hyviäkin esimerkkejä löytämään siitä, miten ikään kuin voidaan loikata uuteen bisnekseen. Aina se sattuu, aina siellä tulee jonkun näköinen droppi. Ja tavallaan tuon tilaajabisneksen osalta, niin on tietysti hyvä huomioida, että esimerkiksi Spotifyn osalta, niin globaalistihan siitä niin kuin se mainosrahoitteinen puolihan on ihan pähkinöitä verrattuna siihen, mitä ne tekee rahaa sillä muulla. Eli se voi sitten yhtäkkiä muuttaa paljon, niin kuin Dan sanoi, sitä mainosinvistä, mutta mä uskon, että se tulee menee niin, että hetkeksi ne poistuu ja sitten sen jälkeen otetaan sekä tilausmaksut että näytetään mainoksetkin vielä. Mutta se ei poista sitä kohdentamishaastetta, mikä tulee sitten keksien poistamisen ja uusien iOS ja muiden päivitysten myötä. Mutta mennään takaisin tuonne saarivaltion suuntaan. So back to you, Dan.
Thank you very much indeed. So now we're on to the final 4 trends of the session. Again, these are all sort of essentially based on technology, although they have been partially influenced or partially accelerated by the pandemic that we find ourselves in. So the next one, trend number, sorry, losing track of time. I think this is trend number 9 is what we call responsible media, and this is really a couple of things. It's a recognition that it's now in the same way for brands to be concerned about brand safety in terms of what other content is appearing on the pages that they're advertising or what is appearing in the video that their pre-roll goes before. It's also about societal safety, where not only what is appearing in the video that goes after their pre-roll, but who these people are, who they're potentially funding, what their political views might be, whether essentially they're making society a better place. So it's all about, sort of responsible media is all about being a responsible advertiser, being, not simply being concerned with brand safety, but also for the publishers and particularly for the user-generated content platforms. It's about them taking much more responsibility over the content on their platforms. And this is something which we're seeing, or which we saw a lot last year through both sort of effects of things like the World Federation of Advertisers, making people like Facebook and YouTube take much more responsibility for their content and be much more willing to take things down from their platform. And as an illustration of where we think we're going with this, what is likely to happen, platforms like Facebook and platforms like YouTube have always been very cautious about removing political content, because they don't want to get in trouble with different political parties and things. But when it came to things like hoaxes around the coronavirus, so things like 5G hoax, they could act really, really quickly, and they removed these sorts of messages and these sorts of videos very quickly. So this gives a sort of indication of how much these sorts of companies can act when they want to, but also how important it is that they take control over their platforms. So in terms of implications, I think it's really important for agencies and for brands to still be incredibly vigilant over where the ads are appearing and thinking about who the ads are funding. But also I think it's really important to take a responsibility to fund a wide range of publishers and to maintain a really sort of vibrant and active and living media ecosystem in terms of things like, diversity of political views and diversity of thought within the publications that we're supporting as well. The next one, the 10th one, is what we call the metaverse. And this is really about the evolution that we're seeing within gaming that is making that is essentially making gaming much more like social media. So, gaming has been popular for many years. Gaming is one of the trends that we talked about last year. But what seems to be happened over the last year or so is that games have become much more social. And part of this is down to the pandemic, in that when people can't physically meet up with their friends, they can meet up with their friends in these virtual worlds. So instead of spending Saturday afternoon in a park with your friends, you might instead spend Saturday afternoon playing Fortnite with your friends, or playing Minecraft, or playing Animal Crossing, or something like this. And it's a way that people have been able to maintain their social connections. So it's really interesting. At the same time, some of the most popular games have been making themselves into much more like social spaces, rather than simply about the gameplay. One example of this is Fortnite, which has introduced what it calls the no combat mode. So instead of going to Fortnite and having to take part in a battle with a group of other people, you can go there simply to chill out. And they've also been putting on special events like concerts by rappers like Travis Scott, films from directors like Christopher Nolan, and essentially making it the sort of place where you want to hang out with your friends. So what we think happen is, if you sort of take this thesis that we have, that gaming is becoming much more like social media, then it could well go the same sort of way that social media has gone, which is being very much a place where people think about buying things, where it's a showcase for things people can buy. And there's actually a lot of commerce now within social media as well, within things like Snapchat. Within things like Snapchat, but also things like Instagram. And so in terms of implications, I know certainly if you're over the age of 45 or so, you might feel quite baffled by games and not really know where to start if we were to talk to you about marketing within games. But actually, if you do see it as very similar to social media, then there's lots of similar things that you can do, because you've got in-feed advertising, you've got influencers in the form of streamers on sites like Twitch. And so I think for many brands, it's now time to start thinking about doing in-game advertising and thinking about how you would communicate in these sorts of environments. The next one leads on from this, and it's what we call social streaming. And so in the same way that millions of people every day go to Twitch to watch somebody play a video game, and they're watching and they're having a chat while they're watching, and they're commenting on the action and those sorts of things. We're starting to see this with things like movies now and episodes of TV shows. And so within platforms like YouTube and Facebook, and even built into things like Netflix, you can now arrange a screening for you and your friends to all watch something simultaneously. And essentially this is just an updated version of watching a football match on TV and being on the phone with your friends at the same time, or watching a reality show and being on WhatsApp or being on Twitter to see what everybody else is thinking of it. And so what we're seeing is more and more platforms offering this service, and potentially more and more consumers taking up the opportunity and using this as a way, again, of being sociable with their friends in the way that they do when they're playing games as well. And we're starting to see brands get involved with this. So the picture, I'm not sure whether you know the character within the picture, but the story is essentially that M&M's, the candy brand, bought the rights to show this British movie to some of the people who follow it on social media just before Christmas. So they bought the rights to essentially create a virtual cinema room with 5,000 seats in it. They screened the film, everybody watched it simultaneously. You could chatter while the film was going on. And, this is something which is quite interesting for brands to get involved with, because one of the things which is one of the sort of sources of friction to stop people doing this is that you have to have access to the rights to do things. So if you want to do this through Amazon Prime, everybody has to have an Amazon Prime membership. But what a brand could bring to this is that they could potentially buy the rights to show something to a group of people online. So I think that's quite interesting. And what they could also do is, potentially organize an after party, or bring one of the actors from a TV show or from a movie to take part in the discussion as well. And so the implication really is, quite simply, if this is the sort of thing that you think that your audience is doing, then it's possible that you might be able to become involved by organizing events for them and then inviting them to take part in these events that you've organized. And then finally, for this deck, the final one of these 12 trends is what we call connecting the dots. And this is really an observation that the big technology platforms have not only done really well through the pandemic, as we've all become a lot more digital, but they've really started to integrate the different elements of the things that they own as well. So possibly the best example of this is Amazon. And I've spoken about Amazon a few times in this presentation because they are such a good example of a brand which, even though they're one of the most valuable companies in the world, they are incredibly agile and they are doing many things. They're leading the trends in many different areas. And one of the things that they've done is they've connected Twitch, which is the game streaming service that they bought about 7 years ago. They've started connecting it to other elements of Amazon. So if you're now an artist within Amazon Music, you can use the Twitch technology to play a live video gig for your fans. And this is something which Spotify would find hard to compete with because Spotify doesn't have these other dots that it can connect to within the things it does. So this is the sort of thing that Amazon is doing. With Google, the sort of things they're doing is they're bringing things like Google Pay into all of the other elements of the things that they do. So this is an example that shows Google Pay being integrated into Google Maps. And so in this example, which I think is a test just happening in the States, you can not only find a parking space within Google Maps, but you can pay for your parking when you get there without actually leaving Google Maps and opening up Google Pay. If you think about Facebook, what they're doing is they're joining everybody, they're joining all their elements together by a sort of common thread of e-commerce. So Instagram, Facebook, and WhatsApp are all connected through different e-commerce tools. And with Apple, what they're doing is they're increasingly bundling their services together. So instead of buying music and TV and gaming individually, you could buy them together as a connected service. And so I think as time goes on, each of these services are going to become more and more sort of like one-stop shops, which is potentially very dangerous for and people like Netflix, but also potentially quite interesting for us as advertisers, because what it might mean is that we might have some really engaging sort of all-encompassing ad formats where potentially, within the same banner, you could click on a button to see the product being made with a live stream. You could click on another button to have a chat with somebody about the product, and then click on a third button to actually buy it without having to go to different websites and different web domains, because everything would be connected together. But anyway, now for the final time, what I wanted to do was to pass back to Juha.
Thank you, Dan. Ja nyt aletaan olemaan tämän meidän trendisetupin loppupuolella. Nyt alkaa olla viimeiset hetket tiputella kysymyksiä tässä samalla, kun mä käyn läpi, mitä tämä tarkoittaa Suomessa, nämä viimeiset tästä pätkästä. Ja niin kuin Dan tuossa sanoi, niin Suomessa edelleen niin kuin peleissä on hirveä potentiaali. Me ollaan nähty, että siellä on NHL tai johonkin ostettu jää- ja laitamainoksia, ja JVGlläkin oli ikään kuin virtuaalikeikka, mutta se ei ollut minkään pelin sisällä silloin viime vappuna. Me nähdään tavallaan niin kuin asioita, jotka saattaisi hypätä sinne peliteollisuuteen Suomessakin, mutta ne ei vielä ehkä sitten ole kuitenkaan mennyt siihen asti, että enemmän ne on niin kuin semmoista Telia eSport-liigaa ja Prismalla on yhteistyötä Havu Gamingin kanssa. Enemmän ne on sellaista niin kuin yhteistyö-sponsorointityyppistä tekemistä vielä ennemmin kuin aidosti sen pelin sisällä olevan niin kuin ajan hyödyntämistä myös kaupalliseen sisältöön, ja se varmaan tästä tulee kuitenkin vielä lähiaikoina. Ja Suomen osalta me ollaan tietysti harvaan asuttu ja yksin viihtyvä kansa, niin edelleen valtaosa katsotaan yksin noista sisällöistä, mikä on tietysti hyvä, sit saa katsoa just sitä, kun huvittaa, mutta palveluissahan on jo nämä ominaisuudet tulossa Suomeenkin, ja niitä on jonkun verran tuolla nähty, mutta tämä vielä vähän meidän osalta odottaa itteensä, että onhan tuolla ollut jotain lätkässä sellaisia, että hurraat tai taputat tai muuta omalle jengille, mutta ne on vähän päälle liimatulla tasolla vielä. Että me ollaan ehkä enemmän siinä second screen -bisneksessä ennemmin kuin yhdessä katsomisessa vielä. Ja sitten kun mietitään connecting the dots, eli Amazonia, Googlea, Facebookia, niin onko se uhka vai mahdollisuus? Se voi markkinoijalle olla mahdollisuus varmastikin lyhyellä tähtäimellä, koska kun keksit kuolee, niin jos saadaan first party dataa noilta toimijoilta, niin se auttaa kummasti viemään asioita eteenpäin, mutta sitten taas toisaalta se on aidosti kuitenkin uhka sit kotimaiselle työllisyydelle ja media-alalle, koska jos kaikki se raha valuu Suomesta ulos, niin silloin se meinaa myös sitä, että työpaikatkin tuppaa jollain aikataululla katoamaan. Et siinä toivoisin tietysti, että sekä me niin kuin toimistojen puolella että asiakkaat että mediat löydetään mahdollisimman hyviä keinoja tehdä ratkaisuja, joka aidosti sit vie kotimaisin voimin niin kuin sitä markkinointiviestinnän tehokkuutta ja vaikuttavuutta eteenpäin, koska eihän siinä ole mistään muusta kyse kuin se, että se, joka on vaikuttavin ja tehokkain niin massana ja kohdennettuna, niin se on se, joka yleensä sen pelin voittaa sitten kuitenkin. Ja tässä trendit. Tältä osin hypätään kysymyksiin. Mä otan tuolta mun ATK-laitteen esille ja täältä katsotaan, mitä meillä olisi tarjolla. Ensimmäinen kysymys on täältä, että nappaan kiinni tuohon Juhan Slideen Helsingin kevyen liikenteen määristä. Tuo 44 pinnan pudotus kuulostaa tosi isolta. Helsingin kevyt liikenne on viikolla 5–16 vs viikko 2020 ja näin poispäin. Toi data, mikä tuossa oli joulukuun 8. päivältä, se perustui Telian anonymisoituun, onpa vaikea sanoa, kuitenkin, niin Telian dataan arkiviikolla, se oli muistaakseni maanantai-keskiviikko-otos siitä, miten ihmiset liikkuu niin kaupunkien ydinkeskustoissa versus sitten edellinen vuosi, joskus helmikuussa. Googlaamalla löytyy Hesarin artikkeli suoraan, missä sitten tarkemmin noi sisällöt siitä sitten löytyy. Mutta ne on vähän eri asioita, että julkinen liikenne ja keskustassa käyminen, niin joo, toivotaan, että sieltä nousee ja mielellään mä näkisin myös tuommoisia -16, -14 lukuja ennemmin kuin tuommoisia, niin että puolet ihmisistä on kadonnut, koska se meinaisi, että markkina on palautumassa normaalimpaan päin. Sitten meillä on täällä kysymys, 2 kysymystä Danille. Ensimmäinen on, että I would like to ask you what trend you are most excited about and which one do you think will be the most important one for the marketers?
So the one I think I'm most excited about is the metaverse. So I think there have always been stories that young people don't use social media like Facebook and things like that. But I think it is really exciting to imagine that if gaming essentially became a new social network, then it could take us into sort of completely new territory. And if you're a fan of science fiction, if you've seen the movie or read the book Ready Player One, then we could be going into that sort of in that sort of area, although not for the time being within virtual reality. So I think that's incredibly exciting. But then also I think the first one that we talked about, the FOGO, the fear of going out trend, I think the whole remote living trend is going to stay with us for quite a while. And I think the really interesting thing is to try to work out how you can encourage people to do things, to live much more, to live much more outdoor lives after we are through this, but also the different sorts of ways that some activities will come back. So I think cinema is a really fascinating industry and stuff. So I think those are the two that I'm most excited about. But yeah, great question. Thank you.
Cool. Then we have a final question, which certainly is related to how you're getting your knowledge, and people are thinking maybe it's a podcast thing. So we have a question: what podcast are you, Dan, listening to at the moment? Which are the best ones you have?
I listen to, so I'm lucky enough to live on my own, so I can walk around my flat listening to podcasts, for several hours a day. So I think the most interesting ones that I listen to, so there's one called Pivot, which has Scott Galloway, which is very good, particularly the Friday edition of that. There's also one. I mean, the other one Kara Swisher does, which I think is called Sway, where she interviews people one-on-one. The most recent episode has Bill Gates, which is really good. So it's things like that, and then also just potentially things like food podcasts or just podcasts where people talk about their lives. So because all of this is really based on trying to understand how people are living their lives and how that is changing over time, and what sort of early adopter activities you're seeing that a small number of people are doing at the moment that many more people might be doing in 5 years' time.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dan. Ja sitten niputetaan päivän tunnin epistola suomeksi. Ja niin kuin Dan tuossa sanoi, niin kaikkihan tämä perustuu kuitenkin aika vahvasti siihen kuluttajien käyttäytymisen ymmärtämiseen, minkä pitää olla kaiken tekemisen perusta. Ja se voi tulla tutkimuksista, se voi tulla podcasteista, ihan ympärille katsomisesta. Ja muistetaan pitää silmät auki ja miettiä, miksi asioita tapahtuu. Kiitos, että olette jaksanut tämän tunnin viettää meidän kanssa. Tämä dekki tulee sitten jälkilähetyksenä sähköpostilaatikoihin ja huhujen mukaan, ja sen ihan väärin ymmärtänyt, niin jossain tuossa kohdilla on myös uutiskirjetilausnapukka, josta voi sitten meidän propagandakirjeen itselleen tilata, missä muun muassa tämän tyyppisiä trendejä ja muuta mielenkiintoista sisältöä sattumanvaraisella tiheydellä kaikille lähetetään. Kiitos siitä, että olette viettäneet tunnin meidän kanssa. Mä oon Juha Halmesvaara ja linjan toisessa päässä, Lontoon päässä, oli Head of Media Futures Dan Calladine, legenda alalla ja maailmassa. Toivottavasti otetaan tämä viimeistään ensi vuonna uudis, mutta mahdollisesti myöhemminkin. Ja meillähän on tulossa Studio Dentsun sisältöä myös myöhemmin ja niihin sitten erillisiä kutsuja luvassa sitten, kun julkaistaan sisältöä ja päästään eteenpäin. Kiitos tästä. Ja nyt 2 minuuttia ihmiselle jää aikaa, niin voitte käydä vaikka hakemassa kahvia ennen seuraavaa Teams-maratonia, joka monella siellä on varmasti edessä. Kiitos kaikille ja hyvää päivänjatkoa.